Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to As of Commons. Tonight we have a very special show talking about something that a lot of people only think about once a year, taxes. We have tonight Richard Phillips, who is a senior policy analyst with the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. He will be talking about the current proposal now making its way through the Big Six in Congress, the GOP, with the administration, and there has been a lot of discussions in the media about how this tax is supposed to help the poor and the middle class of America. Now we will find out from Richard what is the reality of this tax reform. Thank you so much. Hi, Richard. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm glad to be here with you.
Great. Thank you for joining us and to explain to folks here in San Francisco what this tax reform is all about. First, tell us who are the sponsors of this tax
Sure.
reform.
So since the election, there's been this really big push kind of internally within the Republican Party to get
Uh-huh.
everyone on the same page so
Mm-hmm.
that they can kind of put it together. So they didn't want to have what happened with healthcare or with other policies where you have certain senators against it and the administration this way. So they got this working group together, which is they call the Big Six, which is Trump's represented by Gary Cohn, his chief economic advisor, and Stephen Mnuchin, who's his Treasury Secretary, and then it's four other kind of leadership members in Congress. So it's Speaker Paul Ryan, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and then the two heads of the tax writing committees, which is Representative
Mm-hmm.
Kevin
Mm-hmm.
Brady and Senator Orrin Hatch. And so they have together been kind of putting together this framework for months and months now, and they finally released what they call the consensus framework on Wednesday.
Okay, great. Now tell us what exactly is being sold to the American public. As I said earlier in the opening,
Yep.
they're trying to sell it as a tax cut to the middle income and to the poor families. And every American person, every American who's working wants a tax relief. We see our income gets dwindled down. By the time we get our paycheck, half of it is gone.
Mhm.
So we want relief because of the inflation and the cost of living. Everybody is just trying to make it and barely making it.
So the first start off, yeah, we here's what the kind of the distribution of our current tax system looks like. And in contrast to what a lot of kind of conservatives and a lot of people want you to believe, the poor and the working class people actually pay a pretty substantial amount of taxes. So according to our analysis, when you consider federal, state, payroll, and local taxes, people who make around $15,000 are actually still paying about 20% of their income in taxes. And so if you're what would be kind of in the middle. You're making about an average income of 50,500, which is about what we find is the middle. You're actually paying a 27.5% effective tax rate on all your income on average. And so I think what's kind of striking about our tax system is although overall it's slightly progressive, people in the middle aren't paying that much less than those at the top. So right now the middle is paying about 27.5, and those in the top 1% whose average income is about 1.8 million are paying just 34%. So there's not a huge gap between that. And so what our current system is just kind of barely progressive. And I think that our the second chart I had sort of just shows that when you actually look at our tax system overall, it's not that progressive. It's not nearly as progressive as the kind of people want you to believe, because the kind of we hear over and over again, oh well, the poor aren't paying any taxes, or the rich pay 80% of all the taxes. But I think what that really misses is that it misses all the other kinds of taxes that are in our tax system. So there's kind of this tendency to focus just exclusively on the federal income tax, which is relatively progressive, but you ignore what actually is what most people pay more of, which is the payroll tax, or state and local taxes, which is your sales tax, your gas tax, your property tax, which tend to be a higher amount for lower income people. So when you put them all together, our tax cut, it's about $2.4 trillion over 10 years. So it's spending a lot of money on tax cuts. But what's really striking is that almost none of this tax cut overall shows up in the pockets of average working people. And so sure, he has so far kind of designed it so that they do get some crumbs. So if you're making about $15,000 a year, you get maybe around $50 on kind of on average. Or if you're in the middle quintile, you're making say $50,000, you might get about $400
Oh,
behind the Trump tax plan. What you find is that all that kind of from an overall perspective, folks in the lowest kind of end will get a little bit of a tax break on average, but they're not getting very much. So
right.
people in the making that around $15,000, their average tax change would be a $50 tax cut, and those kind of in the middle, were around 50,000, we get about a $400 tax cut.
And then
But
you're
what?
showing here on your chart
Yeah.
that those people who are in the higher bracket, like for instance, people who make what the top third, they will get a $1 million tax
So so so
deduction and so forth.
yeah. So people who are in the top 1%, those making about $1.8 million on average, but a lot of them are making a lot more. They get about a $200,000 tax break on average,
Right,
and
right.
those in the top 0.1%, who on average make something to the effect of about $5 million, they would actually see about $1 million tax break.
Okay,
So
right,
what this kind of shows is just so much more of the tax break is going to those at the top rather than those at the bottom.
right, right. And so your next slide, you're talking about here that the companies hold $2.6 trillion in profits offshore. Talk about
Yeah,
this.
sure. So one of our major areas of study at ITEP is to really dig into how much companies are paying in taxes or a lot of the time not paying in taxes.
Right.
And so one of the big motivators behind this whole entire process is not to give middle class people tax cuts. And in fact, if you look at the tax cut overall, the bulk of it is for businesses, not for individuals. And
Explain,
so,
how do they manage? You have to put money in people's hands, right?
exactly.
Because the average person, whether they're poor or they're middle class or whatever, they buy goods, they buy stuff,
Yeah,
groceries and things like
absolutely.
that, or a new car, clothes and things, which then creates business for the manufacturers, right? Who
Yep,
then
absolutely.
creates business for the distributors, who for the trucking companies, the shipping and so forth, who then creates business for the retailers, who then creates business for the property owners because they have to pay rent, right?
Yep.
And then who then creates money for the salespeople and so forth. That's how you create this economy. But then when you have all the money parked somewhere in tax havens, they're just sitting there, right?
Well, so there's kind of two pieces of this. Is one, actually a lot of this offshore money, which is kind of the most ludicrous part of it, is actually reinvested into U.S. stocks and U.S. things. It's just that they don't have to pay taxes on it. So the real
Okay.
key thing for us has been that the companies have this $2.6 trillion they're holding offshore to avoid taxes, which means that they haven't paid about $750 billion in taxes that they owe, and
Right.
that $750 billion could go to lowering working class people's taxes, or
Right.
frankly, it could go into paving roads and improving schools and
Exactly.
making all kinds
Exactly.
of other public investments, which, like you're saying, are really critical to a better economy because people who have are trucking things around need better roads, and
Right.
everyone needs these kind of things. Or education is kind of the whole standard for
Exactly.
the economy. So that's how they're kind of messing over the entire country by holding this money offshore, is because they're just not paying the taxes they owe on it.
Exactly. Now let me ask you something. I don't know if this is going to be
Mhm.
covered in another slide, but
Sure.
you know, we have these companies who pollute the environment, right?
Sure.
The oil companies, the fracking, the bursting of the pipelines that then contaminate the water system, destroy properties, and so forth, and they get penalized, right? If
Yeah.
they ever. But
Mhm.
then, in terms of taxes, they get to write that thing off, right?
Sure.
So
Yeah.
they
So
get to
so
write them off as losses. So then, if you look at it in all honesty, the taxpayers are paying,
mhm.
right?
Yeah, and so
Then
what we've said, and I believe Elizabeth Warren actually has kind of legislation on this, well, that would at least at the very least tell the public whether or not the companies are getting to write it off. Because there are some rules saying, well, you can't write off certain things and certain other things. But then what companies will do is they'll say, all right, we'll make a deal with the Department of Justice that we'll pay this much as long as it's tax deductible. So what we've kind of been pushing for is at least
right,
transparency on this issue, so that we know, well, how much is the company really paying to the government, and then how much of it is it getting back.
So is this addressed in this tax reform or no?
No, it's not. This issue isn't really addressed. Although, to be fair, like the framework that we have is sort of more big picture. They're about to write, a lot more details. So far, we don't have like legislation which is going to run into the thousands of pages.
Right,
So
right, right,
who knows if they'll address this or make the problem worse.
right,
It's just not.
right.
It's just a detail they haven't addressed yet. So there's a lot here. So I understand. I'll try to take it slow. So the first big thing, and the thing that you're going to be hearing in the coming days, over and over and over from the Trump administration, is this is a big middle class tax cut because we're doubling the standard deduction. But it's actually really a kind of a tricky thing
Yeah.
that they're doing here, because at the same time they're repealing the personal exemption and the additional standard deduction for elderly folks and other things. So rather than doubling your standard deduction, a lot of people are going to see, some people are actually going to see tax increases overall because they use the personal exemptions and other things. Or at the very least, they're not really doubling your standard deduction. They're doubling it, but then a lot of the impact of that is being taken away from repealing the personal exemption. So they're definitely not doing as much as they say they're going to do for you.
Okay.
And then there's a couple other pieces here, which just says they're planning to increase
Yeah,
the
business,
child tax.
how about the business taxes? I mean, these are the components you
Yeah.
have also.
Yeah. Well, and then so on the business side, this is where the real action is, and this is kind of the biggest piece of the entire plan.
Right.
And that's why I was saying, the real game is about kind of letting companies move their money offshore and pay a lower tax rate on the 2.6 trillion they have offshore. So they kind of do two big things here. First, they cut the corporate tax rate from 35% to 20%, and that's about 1.9 trillion dollars. That's a huge portion of this. And then they also, which is a huge problem, is they lower what's called the pass-through tax rate, which is kind of the rate that's on kind of larger businesses that aren't major corporations. And so you're thinking about hedge funds, you're thinking about kind of like wealthier partnerships, like very wealthy lawyers. That's how they do their business.
Right.
And lowering this rate would actually not only give those people a tax break, but it would actually create a real problem and loophole in the tax code, because everyone who's wealthy will suddenly reorganize so that they get paid through a tax-through business. So suddenly, the middle class will be paying the higher rate, and then anyone who has enough money will now be organized as a pass-through business to pay the lower rate.
Wow. Okay. Well,
and then going back to the sort of issue with the offshore money, and this gets a little technical, but it's really important, is they want to enact something called a territorial tax system.
Territorial. Okay.
And what that'll do is that'll actually make it so that they never have to pay taxes on this $2.6 trillion offshore, and any money that they move offshore, they never have to pay taxes on. So right now, eventually companies are supposed to pay taxes on it, and some of them drag their feet and take a long time to do so. But under a territorial tax system, they'll never pay taxes on their offshore profits. And that's another big piece of this, is to help companies move profits offshore and not have to pay anything.
That's terrible. Okay. All right. So then, so you have the broad takeaways here, the huge tax cut overall and so forth.
Yeah. So I think, just to go through them, one, I think that it's important to understand that they've been going around saying that this is tax reform, or this is just, making the system simpler and fairer and easier. But really the core of the plan is a tax cut. And it's mostly a tax cut for the rich. And that's kind of my second point here, is that to the extent that it's a tax cut, it's skewed to the top. And I think I left this a little underemphasized before, but one of the really striking things is, because of what they're doing with the personal exemption and other pieces, the Tax Policy Center found that actually 25% of Americans may actually see a tax increase.
Right.
Because if you get rid of different deductions that people use, then some people benefit,
but
if
for
they
the most part,
weren't using them.
They might get some crumbs, right?
Sorry, what?
They might get some crumbs, but for the most part, it really benefits.
So some people benefit, but then others who are using these different deductions that they're taking away might actually lose. So we're saying it's actually kind of a tax increase on a substantial number of people that then helps pay for the top 1%.
Exactly.
And then I think the third point that I just wanted to kind of emphasize in talking about this is that what came out on Wednesday was really a starting point. So this is the beginning of the real legislative process. And so this is the kind of their broad outline. What's going to be really critical in the next couple months is how they fill in the details. So are they going to make what we kind of see as a really bad plan?
Yeah.
Are they going to actually make it worse as more and more corporate lobbyists come in
Right.
and complain about not getting enough tax breaks, or are they going to make it better?
Right. Yeah. So this.
So I think the next big step, which is a really critical one, is next week they're going to vote on the budget resolution,
Right.
and that's what allows them. It allows them to do two things. Is first, it allows them to do this without and get around the filibuster. So most legislation, and for the last bunch of years, including so much legislation that President Obama tried to pass, you had to get 60 votes to pass it. But there's this special Senate procedure called budget reconciliation that allows you to pass things with just 50 votes. And so this is actually also what they try to do for healthcare reform, and they're trying to do this again for tax reform, but that
Right.
means passing this budget piece. And as part of the budget piece, they have to decide how much they're willing to lose in revenue and how much they're willing to increase the deficit. And so one of the striking things for this battle has been, for the entire past year, and actually for decades now, Republicans have been saying, we care about the deficit. How dare Obama, spend more money
Then
and not pay for it.
Of course, they just passed a $700 billion military budget, right?
Exactly, and so on the tax cut piece of this, they're once again sort of becoming hypocrites. Is when Barack Obama was president, they were saying any new spending had to be paid for, but when it comes to tax cuts, they're saying, oh well, maybe we can just increase the deficit to pass the tax cuts. And right now, what they're saying is that they're going to pass a budget resolution that says we're going to increase the deficit by $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years. And this is despite the fact that every person that has been working on this has been saying, oh, it's not going to lose any money. Well, now they're kind of going back on that. And so then once they pass this budget resolution, that's when the real kind of battle starts.
Right.
And that's why I said the lobbyist battle to end all battles.
Right.
Because every provision of the tax code affects someone.
Of course.
Especially when you're doing corporate things. So for example, one of the biggest fights has been that doubling the standard deduction actually has a really substantial impact on the mortgage interest deduction.
Right.
It means that a lot of people aren't going to be taking the mortgage interest deduction anymore. So the realtors and home builders are going to be spending millions and millions of dollars to fight that part of the provision.
Right.
And you can just see this across the board and across the economy as everyone who is impacted negatively to help pay for some of the tax cuts is going to be lobbying against the plan, and then everyone that's for it is going to be lobbying for the plan, and or to at least keep their positive thing in there. So this is going to be a thing that you should expect millions of dollars to spend. In fact, the Koch brothers and the Chamber of Commerce and a lot of these very wealthy conservative interests have already been spending millions of dollars in the past couple months to help set the stage for this.
Well, at least we have an institution like you. So, Richard, thank you so much. This is incredible. It's just packed with information. So we're going to have to do this again. We'll watch, ladies and gentlemen, how this thing unfolds. Ladies and gentlemen, and again, thank you so much for joining us, and good night.
All right, thank you.